The November evening had settled over the Georgian countryside like a heavy, gray blanket, pressing down on the sparse fields and the twisting dirt roads that led to the solitary farm at the edge of the forest. A chill wind cut through the bare branches of the trees, making them sway and groan in protest, and the fading light painted long shadows that seemed to stretch across the land like fingers reaching for something unseen. The farmhouse, modest and time-worn, squatted among the skeletal oaks and weathered fences as if it had grown from the soil itself, its walls darkened by years of sun and storm. Smoke curled lazily from the stone chimney, dissipating quickly into the encroaching night, carrying with it the faint scent of burning wood and old, worn fabrics. The farm had been quiet for years, its rhythm dictated by the seasons, the cycles of planting and harvesting, the steady breathing of animals in the barn, and the unhurried movements of the man who tended it with relentless discipline. The farmer, a man known to the few in the nearby town as steadfast and unyielding, moved through his evening chores with a quiet precision. His hands, calloused and strong, handled each task with the intimacy of one who had spent decades shaping the land to his will. He was a figure both solitary and imposing, a man whose life had been carved from hardship and whose emotions were often locked away behind a stern, almost impenetrable exterior. Yet, as he completed the final rounds of the barn, checking each animal and adjusting the gates, there was a flicker of unease in the way he paused to glance toward the tree line. Something in the air had shifted, though he could not yet name it. The forest seemed to hold its breath, the rustle of leaves carrying with it an almost imperceptible sense of expectation, as though it were waiting for the arrival of something that had long been overdue. It was then, as the last light of day bled into the horizon, that he saw them, two figures moving cautiously along the narrow path that cut through the field, their forms hunched against the cold, their faces obscured by hoods and scarves. They were girls, or perhaps young women, but the details were blurred by distance and shadow. Their steps were hesitant, faltering at times, as if they were testing the ground beneath them, measuring each movement against some invisible danger. The sight of them sent an immediate jolt of curiosity and concern through the farmer, a sensation he was unaccustomed to experiencing in such intensity. He set down the lantern he carried and watched them approach, noting the careful way they kept to the path, their eyes darting toward the darkened woods as if expecting pursuit. By the time the girls reached the edge of the farm, the darkness had thickened into a cloak that swallowed everything beyond a few feet of the lantern's glow. One of them stopped abruptly, clutching the other's arm, and whispered something that the farmer could not hear. The other, slightly taller and seemingly older, nodded with a grave determination and stepped forward, her eyes catching the flicker of light and reflecting it in a way that made the farmer uneasy. There was a rawness in their appearance, the ragged hems of skirts, the worn leather of boots, the dust and sweat clinging to their hair, that spoke of a long journey, hardship endured, and perhaps fear that ran deeper than the cold night could provoke. The farmer's first instinct was caution. He was a man who had built his life on routine and the careful balance of work and solitude. Yet, there was something about their presence that pried at his moral boundaries, compelling him to act despite the uncertainty. He called out, his voice cutting through the stillness, and they froze, exchanging a glance that held both relief and suspicion. The farmer stepped forward slowly, keeping his hands visible, his posture open, trying to convey safety without overstepping the fragile boundary between stranger and host. He asked if they were lost, and though the older one's voice trembled, she confirmed that they were indeed seeking shelter. It was the kind of request that should have been simple, unremarkable, but under the weight of the night and the isolation of the farm, it became something heavy, laden with implications. Their eyes, wide and haunted, searched his face for judgment, for permission, for reassurance that they could trust him, and in that moment, the farmer felt the full gravity of responsibility settle on his shoulders. He led them inside the farmhouse, the wooden floorboards groaning under their careful steps. Inside, the air was warm, scented faintly of candle wax, smoke, and the earthy tang of dried herbs that hung in small bundles from the ceiling beams. The interior was modest, a single kitchen with a cast-iron stove, a few tables and chairs worn smooth by years of use, and a staircase leading to rooms that had seen decades of solitude. The farmer moved with deliberate calm, offering them a place by the fire, blankets, and water, his mind racing with thoughts of potential dangers, What if they were being pursued? What if they brought trouble to his door? What if his decision to help them endangered the fragile balance of his life? Yet, even as doubts flickered through his mind, there was a pull of empathy he could not deny. Their vulnerability struck a chord he had long buried, a reminder of lost siblings, friends, or family he had never had, and he found himself unwilling to turn them away. The sisters, though hesitant, began to relax slightly in the presence of warmth and light. Their shivering lessened, though a tension lingered in the way they held their hands close to their bodies, and the flicker of fear remained in their eyes. Their story was not told in words yet, it was conveyed through glances, the subtle tremor in a shoulder, the way one would cling to the other as if she were the only anchor in a world suddenly vast and threatening. The farmer observed carefully, noting the signs, attempting to understand without pressing, respecting the delicate balance between protection and intrusion. Outside, the wind continued to whistle through the trees, carrying sounds from the forest that seemed alive with intention, as though the night itself were a witness to the fragile alliance forming inside the farmhouse. Hours passed in a slow, measured rhythm. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows along the walls, and the farmer found himself speaking softly, recounting mundane details of farm life, stories of the seasons, the animals, and the routines that had long defined his existence. The sisters listened quietly, their eyes heavy with fatigue, yet absorbing each word with a mixture of wonder and caution. The narrative is punctuated by long silences, the weight of unspoken questions, the tension of uncertainty, and the subtle understanding that the arrival of these two figures had disrupted something far greater than the simple rhythm of a solitary life. Outside, darkness deepened into a tangible presence, pressing against the windows and doors, making the farmhouse feel both protected and exposed. The forest loomed like a living wall, its branches clawing at the sky, and every rustle of leaves or snap of twigs sent flinches through the sisters and a tightening in the farmer's chest. Sleep was uneasy, and the long hours before dawn were filled with quiet contemplation, both from the young women and the man who had chosen to harbor them. Thoughts raced, about the journey that had brought them here, the dangers they might have escaped, and the unknown threats that still lingered in the shadows beyond the farm's perimeter. By the early hours of morning, the first pale light began to seep over the horizon, casting a muted glow across the fields. The sisters had finally dozed, leaning against the chairs he had provided, and the farmer remained by the window, watching the day arrive with the weight of choices pressing upon him. He understood that this night, simple and quiet as it seemed, was the first in a series of events that would challenge everything he believed about safety, trust, and morality. The chill of the previous evening had not entirely lifted, nor had the tension that clung to the air. Instead, it had transformed into a heavy awareness that life on this farm, in this quiet corner of Georgia, would never be the same. The forest behind the farmhouse seemed to sigh with the coming light, its shadows retreating but not vanishing, hinting that secrets still lingered among the trees. The wind carried with it the faint scent of earth and decay, subtle reminders that the world beyond the safety of the walls was complex, unpredictable, and often cruel. And within the farmhouse, the fragile warmth of human connection, the soft murmurs of exhausted voices, the careful movements to avoid waking each other, the small acts of care between the farmer and the sisters, stood in stark contrast to the darkness outside. The night had ended, but the consequences of choice, of shelter, and of trust were only just beginning to unfold, promising that the days ahead would be filled with tension, moral complexity, and an emotional journey that would test each soul in ways neither could yet imagine. The early morning carried with it a silence that was both comforting and oppressive. The rooster's distant crow punctuated the stillness, and somewhere in the forest, an unseen animal stirred, its movements echoing faintly across the frost-laden grass. The farmer moved about the kitchen with care, tending to chores as he had for decades, yet now his thoughts were fragmented by the presence of the sisters. Every sound, every shadow, every creak of the old wood was filtered through a lens of heightened awareness, as though the farm itself had become attuned to the delicate balance between protection and exposure, between care and risk. By mid-morning, the sisters began to awaken, their eyes adjusting to the dim light, their expressions wary but curious. They shared no words at first, but small gestures, a nod, a tentative smile, the careful arrangement of clothing to dry near the fire, communicated gratitude, fear, and trust simultaneously. The farmer observed silently, understanding that the fragile threads of connection formed in the dark hours of the previous night would determine the unfolding of the events yet to come. Each moment was weighted, charged with anticipation, and framed by the quiet grandeur of the early Georgian landscape, where history, isolation, and human emotion intertwined with almost cinematic intensity. By the time the sun rose fully, spilling golden light across the fields and igniting the first stirrings of life in the farmyard, the night's events had left an indelible mark on all present. The sisters' journey had brought them to safety, but also into a web of uncertainty and moral ambiguity that would shape every action in the days ahead. The farm, with its creaking floors, the smell of wood smoke, and the dense forest framing its edges, had become a stage for events that would test courage, challenge morality, and unfold with a suspense that seemed to echo from the land itself. And as the wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of distant rain and untold stories, it became clear that the night's arrival had been only the opening act in a story that would ripple across lives and linger long after the sun had set again. The day moved forward slowly, the quiet interrupted only by the soft sounds of the farm, the lowing of cattle, the rhythmic scrape of a hoe in the soil, the distant call of birds returning to the bare trees. Every gesture, every movement, seemed charged with a tension born of the night's events. The farmer, the sisters, and the land itself were bound in a fragile equilibrium, a delicate dance of trust, fear, and anticipation. And in the spaces between the ordinary sounds of farm life, the narrative held a breathless pause, waiting for the next step, the next choice, the next revelation that would push each character further along a path from which there might be no return. The rest of the day unfolded in a rhythm both ordinary and strange. Meals were prepared and eaten quietly, chores completed with careful attention, and conversations skirted around topics too dangerous to name. The sisters learned the layout of the farm, the location of the animals, the sources of water and fire, and the simple routines that had long governed the farmer's life. In turn, the farmer observed their habits, their small interactions, the subtle ways they communicated fear, hope, and resilience. Each moment built on the last, constructing a web of emotional tension, subtle foreshadowing, and the kind of intimacy that only arises from shared hardship and mutual reliance. By evening, shadows once again lengthened across the farm. The sisters, exhausted from travel and the intensity of the day, settled near the fire, their expressions softened but still alert. The farmer, seated nearby, felt the weight of responsibility more keenly than ever, knowing that whatever storms lay ahead, both literal and metaphorical, would test the strength of the fragile bonds forged in the quiet darkness of the previous night. The farm, the forest, and the wind outside all seemed to conspire in a story that was only beginning, promising that the days to come would be marked by suspense, moral complexity, and an emotional depth that would resonate long after the sisters' presence became a memory. The chill night returned, creeping across the fields and through the thin walls of the farmhouse. The sisters slept fitfully, the farmer watched silently, and the forest waited. Every rustle, every flicker of shadow, every whisper carried with it the sense that life on the farm would never again settle into its previous, predictable rhythm. The stage had been set. The players were in place. And the story, intricate, eerie, and emotionally resonant, had begun in earnest. The first night had ended, but its consequences were far from over. The fragile threads of trust, the burden of moral choice, and the tension between safety and danger would ripple through every subsequent moment. The farmer understood that the simple act of offering shelter had irrevocably altered his life, binding him to the sisters and to events whose full weight he could not yet fathom. Outside, the wind continued its restless journey through the trees, carrying the faint echoes of paths traveled, dangers escaped, and mysteries yet to unfold, setting the tone for a narrative steeped in suspense, emotion, and the chilling beauty of the unknown. The morning light revealed subtle changes in the landscape, the frost on the grass, the dew on the leaves, and the quiet movement of birds beginning their day. Within the farmhouse, small domestic sounds, the drip of water from the kettle, the soft creak of chairs, the muted clatter of dishes, marked the passage of time, but beneath these ordinary noises lay a tension that had not dissipated. Every glance, every hesitation, every unspoken thought between the farmer and the sisters carried meaning, layering the narrative with a sense of depth, foreboding, and emotional complexity. The farm's isolation, once merely a practical reality, now felt like a cocoon protecting fragile lives from a world that was often cruel and unpredictable. Yet, the very isolation heightened the suspense. Danger could arrive at any moment, human or otherwise, and the consequences of even the smallest choices were magnified. The sisters' presence was a living catalyst, stirring emotions long dormant in the farmer and revealing cracks in the carefully constructed walls of routine and detachment. Their journey had introduced uncertainty into a life once governed entirely by predictability, and the story's tension grew from the contrast between the familiar and the unknown, the ordinary and the extraordinary, the safe and the perilous. By mid-morning, small gestures, reaching for a blanket, sharing water, helping with a chore, built a quiet intimacy between the characters. Words remained sparse, their scarcity amplifying the significance of each utterance. The farmer's observations became acute, noticing minute changes in posture, tone, and expression, and interpreting them with the meticulous care of a man who understood the delicate nature of trust. The sisters, in turn, responded with cautious acceptance, learning to navigate the boundaries of their temporary refuge. As the sun climbed higher, the landscape transformed. Shadows shortened, fields glistened with dew, and the distant forest seemed simultaneously inviting and menacing. Each moment carried with it an undercurrent of suspense, the sense that the quiet harmony of farm life was temporary, fragile, and perhaps illusory. The narrative, slow-burning and deliberate, immerses the reader in sensory details, the smell of earth, the sound of distant water, the texture of wood and fabric, heightening the emotional resonance of the unfolding events and ensuring that every scene, however mundane, pulses with latent tension and meaning. By afternoon, the sisters ventured cautiously outside, testing the boundaries of their temporary haven. The farmer followed at a discreet distance, his presence protective but unobtrusive. Their movements through the fields, along the fences, and toward the forest edge were laden with unspoken fears, hopes, and anticipation. Every rustle of leaves, every shadow cast by the low sun, seemed imbued with significance, magnifying the suspense and deepening the emotional stakes. The day gradually gave way to evening once more. The sky blazed with the warm hues of sunset, but the shadows lengthened quickly, reclaiming the land and reminding the inhabitants of the farm that night would soon return. The sisters settled near the fire again, exhausted but quieter, and the farmer felt the full weight of the night's responsibilities pressing upon him. He reflected on the journey that had brought these young women to his doorstep and on the unknown perils that still lay beyond the horizon. The night promised rest, but beneath it lingered tension, moral complexity, and the sense that the farm, the sisters, and he himself were now entwined in a story whose ramifications could not yet be measured. The long evening passed with quiet observation, occasional conversation, and moments of silence so profound that every sound, the crackle of the fire, the whistle of the wind, the distant call of animals, was amplified, reminding all present of the fragility of their temporary sanctuary. The sisters slept fitfully, haunted by memories of the journey and the dangers left behind, while the farmer remained vigilant, aware that any lapse in attention could have dire consequences. The interplay between trust, fear, and empathy shaped each interaction, building suspense not through overt danger but through the emotional intensity of their shared experience. As the first light of dawn approached once more, the farmhouse, the fields, and the forest were steeped in quiet anticipation. The farmer, now intimately aware of the sisters' presence, and the sisters, cautiously observing their host, were bound by a night of shared vulnerability. Every sound, every movement, and every glance carried weight, creating an atmosphere of tension, suspense, and emotional resonance. The opening night had not only set the stage for what was to come but had also irrevocably altered the landscape of human connection, morality, and trust that would define the days ahead. The first chapter of this story, measured in hours of night and dawn, had extended into a tapestry of human emotion, isolation, and subtle suspense. The forest beyond the farmhouse, the wind through the trees, the uneven floors and dimly lit rooms, all had become actors in a narrative where every detail mattered. As the day fully awakened, the farm stood as a witness to the arrival of the sisters, the choices made by the farmer, and the unspoken tension that would carry forward into a story rich with mystery, moral conflict, and the slow-burning unease that defines a tale of suspense and historical intrigue. The boundaries between safety and danger, between care and fear, between trust and suspicion had already begun to blur. Each small gesture, each decision, each passing hour contributed to a building tension that would shape the narrative in ways yet unforeseen. Though the farm sprawled across a gently undulating landscape, its borders defined by weathered wooden fences that had been patched and repaired over decades. Each post and rail bore the marks of time and labor, telling silent stories of seasons past and the hands that had labored over them. Beyond the fences, the land stretched into pastures dotted with wildflowers, patches of untamed grass, and clusters of scrub oak that framed the edges of small fields. The soil was rich and dark, tilled each year with meticulous care, yet it bore the subtle signs of neglect in corners where the farmer's attention had been diverted elsewhere. The homestead itself was modest but functional, a structure of sturdy timbers and rough-hewn stone, its walls absorbing the rhythm of the sun, wind, and rain over decades. Windows, small and rectangular, were rimmed with peeling paint, and the door, heavy and scarred by countless seasons, creaked on worn hinges. Every aspect of the farm reflected the life of its keeper, practical, resilient, and shaped by years of quiet labor. The farmer moved through his domain with the ease of someone who had spent his entire life within its boundaries. His routine was both strict and intimate. He knew every inch of the land, every animal's temperament, every quirk of weather that signaled an impending storm or a favorable harvest. Morning began long before sunrise, with a walk through the fields to assess the soil and check the fences. His hands were rough and calloused, nails permanently stained by earth, and veins prominent from years of work that had demanded strength and endurance. Yet beneath the rough exterior lay a mind finely attuned to observation, capable of noticing small deviations in behavior, the faintest signs of illness in an animal, or subtle changes in the landscape that might otherwise go unnoticed. The farm was an extension of himself, and he tended it with a devotion that bordered on reverence. He lived alone, save for the animals and the occasional visiting neighbor, and this solitude had shaped him profoundly. His early life had been marked by hardship, orphaned at a young age, raised by distant relatives who valued labor over affection. He learned early to rely upon his own strength and judgment. Emotional restraint became second nature. He found comfort in routine, in the predictable cycles of planting, tending, and harvesting. Companionship had been scarce, and the farm became both refuge and prison, a place where he could exert control over a small corner of the world while keeping the uncertainties of human relationships at bay. Over time, this life of careful isolation had become his identity, a fortress against the chaos of the world beyond his fences. The interior of the farmhouse reflected the same austere philosophy. Rooms were sparsely furnished, a sturdy wooden table, chairs worn smooth by decades of use, shelves lined with practical tools and a handful of books with frayed covers. The kitchen was the heart of the home, dominated by a cast-iron stove whose blackened surface told of countless meals prepared to sustain both body and spirit. A single lantern provided dim illumination in the evening, casting long, flickering shadows that made the rooms feel both intimate and haunted. Small details, such as the arrangement of dried herbs hanging from beams or the careful stacking of firewood, revealed a meticulous mind attentive to both function and order. Everything had its place, and deviation from the routine was both discomforting and noticeable. The land itself held secrets in its subtle rhythms. Each season carried its own demands and perils. Spring brought muddy fields and the necessity of planting seeds with exacting care. Summer was a season of labor, with long hours beneath a sun that could scorch both land and body. Autumn delivered the harvest, a mixture of triumph and exhaustion, while winter brought cold, isolation, and the need for careful planning to ensure survival through months of scarcity. The farmer understood these cycles intimately, and they had shaped both his body and mind into instruments of endurance, observation, and careful judgment. Yet even within this predictable framework, the land could surprise: sudden storms, unexpected frosts, or the mysterious disappearance of animals all served as reminders of forces beyond human control. His relationship with the animals mirrored his approach to the land. Each creature was known by name and habit, each cared for with a combination of firmness and attention that ensured their survival and productivity. Horses were brushed and fed at precise intervals, cows were milked with practiced hands, chickens and pigs received care that balanced necessity with a quiet understanding of their nature. In tending them, the farmer found not only sustenance but companionship, the subtle comfort of life that responded to care, and the satisfaction of mastery over a small, self-contained ecosystem. Animals, unlike humans, did not deceive or betray, their behaviors were predictable, their needs understandable, and their presence a stabilizing force in a life otherwise shaped by solitude. The surrounding forest, however, was less predictable. At the edge of the farm, trees grew thick and ancient, their roots twisted beneath the soil, and their branches interwoven into a canopy that allowed only specks of light to penetrate. The forest was both protective and threatening. It provided wood for fuel and shelter but also harbored wildlife and the unknown, lending an ever-present tension to life on the farm. The farmer understood this duality, respecting the forest's rhythms while remaining vigilant for its dangers. On cold nights, the wind would howl through the trees, carrying with it sounds that suggested movement and life beyond comprehension. These nocturnal whispers were reminders that the farm, though a place of careful order, existed alongside forces that could never be fully controlled. The farmer's solitary existence had also shaped his mind. He was a man who thought deeply, observed keenly, and acted decisively when necessary. Years of labor and isolation had honed his capacity for patience, endurance, and moral reflection. He spent hours in contemplation, often staring out over the fields as the sun rose or set, considering the minutiae of farm life, the patterns of the seasons, and the subtle shifts in his own thoughts and emotions. He had learned to weigh actions carefully, to anticipate consequences, and to understand that every choice, no matter how small, carried implications that could ripple through both human and natural realms. Though his life was austere, it was not devoid of reflection or memory. He often recalled the sparse interactions of his youth, the strict relatives, the brief friendships, and the fleeting moments of joy and loss that had shaped him. These memories lingered, sometimes as comfort, sometimes as sorrow, but always as silent guides informing his decisions. The farm, in this sense, was both present and historical, a living testament to years of survival, labor, and moral calculation. The rhythms of work and the solitude of the land became intertwined with the structure of his mind, each reinforcing the other in a pattern of enduring discipline. The farmer's routine extended to the minutiae of daily life, the careful tending of crops, the rotation of pastures, the meticulous repair of fences, and the management of supplies to ensure nothing went to waste. Even seemingly minor acts, the arrangement of tools, the repair of a broken chair, or the tending of a small garden, were executed with precision and care. In these acts, the farmer found both comfort and meaning, a demonstration of competence and control in a world that could be otherwise unpredictable and unforgiving. Despite the isolation, he was not entirely disconnected from the surrounding community. Occasionally, he visited the small nearby town to trade goods or obtain supplies, navigating social interactions with a mixture of politeness and guarded reserve. Gossip and opinion held weight in these excursions, and he understood the delicate balance of maintaining reputation while protecting his autonomy. The townspeople saw him as reliable, hard-working, and slightly distant, a man to be respected but not necessarily known. This perception allowed him a measure of freedom, preserving the sanctuary of his farm while keeping the mechanisms of the wider world at a manageable distance. His life was also marked by a profound sense of rhythm and timing. The day began before dawn, continued with structured labor, and ended with a quiet reflection as the sun set behind the forested hills. Meals were simple and practical, prepared with care but never indulgence. Sleep followed the natural cycles of light and dark, though often interrupted by concerns for the land, animals, or unforeseen events. Even in solitude, his existence was disciplined, orchestrated with a deliberate awareness of every action and its consequences. This careful structure provided security, but it also made any deviation, a new presence, a sudden threat, or unexpected event, both destabilizing and emotionally significant. The farm's architecture reflected the farmer's character, pragmatic, resilient, and unobtrusive. Low ceilings and small windows retained warmth during winter, while thick walls insulated against summer heat. Every door, every threshold, was designed for function, often bearing the subtle scars of decades of use. Rooms were sparsely furnished yet sufficient, with a small library of well-worn books revealing a mind interested in knowledge, history, and practical matters. The interior was a refuge from both weather and world, a controlled environment where the farmer could exercise agency over the rhythms of life, uninterrupted by external chaos. Animals, weather, and the land itself were constant companions and teachers. Each day presented lessons: a sick calf, a broken fence, or an early frost demanded attention and response. The farmer approached each problem with methodical thought, weighing options, anticipating outcomes, and acting decisively. Over decades, this accumulation of experience had honed not only his skill in survival but also his understanding of human nature, the delicate balance between strength and vulnerability, and the intricate relationship between cause and effect in a life dictated by both labor and morality. The land held memories as well as challenges. Stone walls marked the boundaries of fields long abandoned, gnarled trees stood as witnesses to years of labor and loss, paths through the forest hinted at journeys taken and untaken. The farmer, attuned to these markers, read the land like a text, understanding both its history and its potential. Every ridge, furrow, and hollow told a story of survival, growth, and adaptation, and these stories informed his decisions, his expectations, and his understanding of the delicate balance between control and surrender in a life entwined with nature. The farm was more than a home, it was an ecosystem, a carefully balanced microcosm of life, labor, and observation. The rhythm of daily tasks, the cycles of planting and harvest, the care of animals, and the attention to weather and land formed a tapestry of interconnected elements. The farmer existed within this tapestry, shaping it with hands, decisions, and foresight, while simultaneously being shaped by its demands, its unpredictability, and its enduring presence. By evening, the farmhouse would glow faintly against the encroaching darkness, the smoke from the chimney curling upward as a quiet signal of human presence. Inside, the air carried the mingled scents of wood smoke, herbs, and cooking, each smell a marker of life sustained and care extended. The farmer moved within these spaces with a quiet authority, his awareness spanning the rooms, the animals, and the land beyond. In this environment, the ordinary was imbued with significance. Each sound, each shadow, each movement carried meaning, reinforcing both his solitude and his mastery over a world measured, ordered, and intimately known. The night brought reflection, quiet observation, and attentiveness to every sound outside, the snap of a twig, the distant call of an animal, the whisper of wind through the forest. The farmer's vigilance was not born of paranoia but of careful understanding. Life on the farm demanded it. Through decades of labor and isolation, he had cultivated both skill and intuition, creating a life of endurance, contemplation, and quiet moral authority. And so, the farm and its keeper existed in a delicate balance, a life defined by routine, shaped by labor, and haunted by solitude, yet alive with observation, knowledge, and the potential for events that could disrupt even the most carefully ordered world. It was into this world that the two sisters would arrive, their presence introducing tension, uncertainty, and the slow unraveling of a life that had been measured, predictable, and profoundly solitary. The stage was set, the rhythms established, and the characters poised for the unfolding of a narrative rich in suspense, emotion, and historical texture. The land, the animals, the farmhouse, and the farmer were intertwined, each influencing the other, creating a living environment that demanded attention, care, and moral judgment. Within this context, any intrusion, any new presence, carried enormous significance, and the arrival of the sisters promised to challenge the boundaries of trust, the structures of routine, and the emotional equilibrium that had been painstakingly cultivated over decades. The farm was a world unto itself, and the story about to unfold would test its limits, revealing both the fragility and resilience of human and natural life in the face of unexpected intrusion and moral complexity. The wind shifted, the trees whispered, and the quiet farm awaited the unfolding of events that would alter its history forever. The farmer, unaware of the full consequences yet instinctively prepared to respond, stood as both guardian and observer, ready to navigate the intricate web of choices, risks, and emotions that the arrival of the sisters had set in motion. Within the familiar rhythms of work and solitude, a new narrative had begun, one that would stretch the limits of endurance, morality, and the human heart, leaving a mark upon the farm and its keeper that would linger long after the initial intrusion had passed. The farmhouse, the fields, the surrounding forest, and the creatures that populated them became actors in a drama of quiet suspense, moral ambiguity, and human endurance. Each element, the worn floors, the flickering lantern, the distant forest shadows, the scent of earth, the lowing of cattle, was suffused with significance. In the precise ordering of daily life and the careful observation of the natural world, the farmer had cultivated a sense of control. Yet, as the sisters' journey approached the farm's threshold, this control was poised to be tested in ways both subtle and profound, setting the stage for a narrative that would intertwine human emotion, historical realism, and suspense with cinematic intensity. The hours stretched into evening, and the farm took on a different rhythm. Shadows deepened, the air cooled, and the familiar sounds of animals and wind carried an unfamiliar tension. The farmer's awareness was heightened, his movements deliberate, and his attention to detail sharpened. Every detail, the creak of the door, the flicker of the candle, the distant murmur of the forest, was imbued with meaning. This world, so carefully ordered, had become a landscape of uncertainty and anticipation, awaiting the arrival of events that would test the farmer's skill, judgment, and moral compass. The farm, at once sanctuary and crucible, had prepared its keeper for life's challenges, yet it could not have prepared him for the intrusion of unexpected human presence. The arrival of the sisters would transform routine into suspense, solitude into moral complexity, and familiarity into a landscape of tension. Within the ordered rhythm of daily labor and contemplation, an intricate and emotionally resonant story was poised to unfold, and the farm, its keeper, and its new inhabitants were now entwined in a narrative of suspense, moral ambiguity, and historical realism that would stretch across weeks, months, and the delicate fabric of human emotion. The night finally descended in full, casting darkness across the fields, the forest, and the farmhouse. The wind carried both the scent of damp earth and the whispers of an approaching story that would challenge every measure of patience, endurance, and moral judgment. Within the farmhouse, the quiet persisted, yet tension hung in the air like a tangible presence. The farmer's life, shaped by decades of solitude and labor, was on the cusp of transformation. The land he had mastered, the animals he had tended, and the routines he had meticulously maintained were about to intersect with human drama in ways he could neither predict nor entirely control. And so, the farm awaited the coming days, its keeper poised between the familiar order of life and the unpredictable intrusion of circumstance. The land, the house, the animals, and the rhythms of work would all play a role in a story defined by suspense, historical texture, and emotional resonance. The careful balance of solitude and observation, control and vulnerability, had been established over decades. Yet, in the quiet of evening, beneath the heavy shadows and the restless wind, it was evident that this balance would soon be challenged in profound and lasting ways, setting the stage for a narrative that would test the very fabric of human endurance, morality, and connection. The farm, its keeper, and the life painstakingly cultivated within its borders had formed a fragile ecosystem of routine, observation, and survival. Yet, the arrival of the sisters promised to introduce variables that would disrupt this equilibrium, challenging the farmer's understanding of trust, compassion, and moral responsibility. Within this world, every detail, the creak of the floorboards, the flicker of the lantern, the whisper of wind through the trees, the scent of the earth, and the movements of the animals, took on heightened significance. The stage was fully set, the players in place, and the narrative poised to unfold in a slow-burning tapestry of suspense, human emotion, and historical realism. The shadows of evening deepened as the stars emerged overhead, their faint glimmering providing the only illumination for the vast fields and dense forest beyond the farmhouse. The wind carried faint sounds from the surrounding woods, subtle reminders of the living, breathing world outside the carefully maintained boundaries of the farm. The farmer, attuned to every nuance of sound and movement, sensed the delicate shift in atmosphere, the prelude to events that would demand moral judgment, patience, and emotional endurance. He moved quietly through the rooms, checking on the animals and ensuring that the fire would burn steadily through the night, each action a reflection of decades of habit and careful observation. By the first hints of dawn, a delicate interplay of light and shadow began to shift across the farm. The low sun illuminated the frost on the ground, the edges of wooden fences, and the tops of shrubs and trees, creating a landscape both familiar and subtly altered by the changing light. Within the farmhouse, the air carried the mingled scents of wood smoke, earth, and drying laundry. The farmer paused to observe, taking in the quiet beauty of the morning while remaining mindful of the work ahead. Each detail, each movement, each sound was catalogued with the precision of a man whose life had been measured by observation and labor, setting the tone for the days to come. The day began in earnest, with the farmer moving through the fields to tend to crops, inspect fences, and care for animals. Each task was executed with the precision of habit, yet now imbued with an undercurrent of anticipation. The rhythms of labor were familiar, yet each step was tinged with a sense of unease, a recognition that the arrival of the sisters, though not yet physically present, would soon intersect with the ordered life he had cultivated. The farm, the animals, the land, and the man himself existed in a state of poised equilibrium, ready to respond to the unfolding narrative with both resilience and tension. Even as the morning progressed, subtle changes in the environment reinforced the slow-building suspense. A distant hawk's call, the rustle of the forest, and the shifting patterns of light on the ground all seemed to signal that the ordinary had been quietly transformed by anticipation. The farmer moved with heightened awareness, each step measured, each action deliberate. The farm was a world of intricate detail, and he was its master, attuned to every nuance that could influence survival, morality, or the unfolding of unforeseen events. The period of early adolescence, covering the twins' years from 10 to 14, marked the decisive point where the initial oddity hardened into an unyielding, psychological reality for the Vance household. The spatial constraints of the plantation were now mirrored by the temporal constraints of the girls' minds. The gulf between Alara and Lyra was no longer a matter of different interests, it became an absolute incompatibility of existence, a relentless, slow-burning fire that consumed the parents' hope. Alara's devotion to the 18th century became complete and absolute. She demanded to be addressed with formal titles, rejected any food or social custom introduced after the year 1800, and spent her mornings meticulously transcribing historical documents in a copperplate hand, often including footnotes that contained information unavailable in any public record, suggesting first-hand knowledge. She was a ghost of politeness and archaic refinement. Her vocabulary was a relic, using phrases and grammatical structures long abandoned by 1871. When describing the 1870s, she spoke with the detached judgment of a historian viewing a barbarous interlude, finding the industrial soot and lack of defined social hierarchy profoundly distressing. Her clothes, carefully tailored by Elizabeth to mimic the styles of the 1780s, were her shield against the confusing present. Lyra, meanwhile, began to show genuine symptoms of temporal alienation. She wasn't merely talking about the future, she was mourning it. She would wake up screaming from nightmares of crowded, noisy cities, only to realize the silence of the 1870s was the reality. Her drawings grew more detailed and technically sound, perfect cross-sections of combustion engines, detailed wiring diagrams for electrical grids, and architectural plans for colossal, glass and steel skyscrapers. She read every science periodical Silas reluctantly provided, not for new knowledge, but as a nostalgic confirmation of what she already knew would exist. The sheer, overwhelming simplicity of 1871, the slow pace, the dependence on horsepower, the limits of kerosene light, crushed her restless, futuristic spirit. The parents, driven by desperation, sought out the counsel of Reverend Josiah Albright, the most respected spiritual leader in the county. Albright initially diagnosed hysteria rooted in sibling rivalry but quickly retreated after an unnerving session of prayer. He found that when reciting biblical passages, Elara would interrupt with scholarly corrections based on obscure 18th-century translations, while Lyra would challenge the entire concept of the soul using terminology derived from theoretical physics and cosmology that would only emerge in the late 20th century. Albright declared the girls were not possessed, but rather touched by a divine, inexplicable sorrow, and refused to return, leaving the Vances utterly isolated in their mystery. The tutors, the doctors, and the clergy had all failed. The Vance family resigned themselves to a state of perpetual, strained silence. Meals were held in complete quiet, as any topic of conversation, politics, weather, neighbors, would immediately draw forth a cascade of conflicting temporal commentary. The twins, though physically inseparable, occupied spaces so mentally distant that the very air between them felt thin and cold. The quiet, repetitive rhythm of plantation life now served only as a monotonous, unchanging backdrop to the continuous, psychological warfare being waged between two incompatible centuries coexisting under one roof. The tragedy was that neither twin was mad, both were simply authentic citizens of times that were not 1871. They were living proofs of a paradox that was slowly beginning to dismantle the sanity of everyone around them. The relentless, low-grade tension that had defined the Vance household for years snapped abruptly during the summer the twins turned 16. It was a humid, still week, when the Georgia heat felt like a physical weight, pressing down on the consciousness. Both Elara and Lyra fell ill simultaneously, struck by a fever so violent and sudden that Dr. Thorne, summoned from his self-imposed retirement, feared they would not survive the night. The illness, perhaps a virulent strain of influenza, acted as a temporal catalyst, momentarily shattering the separate realities the girls had meticulously constructed. As the fever raged, a change came over them. The polite distance and chronological segregation that usually governed their behavior dissolved. They writhed in their beds, their faces slick with sweat, but their babbling was not the incoherent delirium of ordinary sickness. Their voices, usually distinct in tone and accent, Elara's formal and measured, Lyra's quick and energetic, merged into a terrifying, unified sound. They began to speak in a language their parents did not understand, a guttural, European tongue. And then, the true horror began. At precisely 3 a.m., in the absolute dead stillness of the house, both twins screamed. It was not a scream of pain, but of profound, immediate agony and terror. And they screamed the same two facts, a date, October 24, 1943, and a name, Elias Roth. Lyra screamed the name with the raw, visceral shock of a witness recoiling from a fresh tragedy. Elara screamed the date with the flat, chilling finality of an official record. They continued to chant the two facts, their voices weaving together like a dark, terrible counterpoint, until the fever broke with the morning light. When the twins awoke, they were physically exhausted but mentally lucid. Elizabeth and Silas, shaking, insisted on knowing what the date and the name meant. Elara, pale but composed, described a chilling historical event she claimed to have studied, the extermination of a specific Jewish community in occupied Poland during the Second World War. She spoke of the man, Elias Roth, as an obscure statistic, one of millions lost in the mechanized horror of the mid-20th century. Her account was detailed, historically verifiable down to the unit responsible for the transport, yet delivered with the detached stoicism of a scholar reporting findings. Lyra, however, could not speak, she could only weep. When she finally found her voice, she described the same events, but from the inside. She detailed the cold of the boxcar floor, the smell of coal smoke and fear, the kindness of a man named Elias Roth who shared his last piece of bread, and the crushing moment of his death. She described the tragedy not as an entry in a history book, but as a personal, devastating loss. For a brief, horrible hour in their fevered state, the sisters had not just shared a room, they had shared a moment in time, a moment that lay 72 years in the future, and one that was drenched in blood. This incident served as the family's first turning point, the definitive proof that the phenomenon was not isolated to their daughters' minds but was tied to some external, verifiable historical reality. Silas, his religious certainty finally cracked, knew he could no longer keep the secret. This was not possession, this was paradox. The shared wound, so terrifyingly accurate, forced the Vances to abandon their sanctuary of denial and reach out into the world, seeking external, official recognition of the impossible. The terrifying, unified scream signaled the end of their private mystery and the beginning of their public scandal. The terrifying synchronicity of the fever dream forced Silas Vance to take the unprecedented and calamitous step of seeking public assistance, thereby exposing the family's fragile secret to the pitiless scrutiny of the wider community. The immediate reaction of the surrounding rural settlements was not pity or scientific curiosity, but fear, distilled through the rigid lens of 19th-century religious dogma. The primary arbiter of opinion was the local church, led by the previously consulted Reverend Albright, who now wielded his influence with zealous certainty. Having failed to cure the girls with prayer, he shifted his diagnosis from divine sorrow to outright demonic possession. The details of the twins' shared future memory, particularly Lyra's descriptions of industrialized warfare, nuclear energy, and secular moral decay, were seized upon by the pulpit as irrefutable proof of commerce with infernal knowledge. The notion that the children were recounting history yet to be lived was too complex for the congregation. It was simpler, and infinitely more terrifying, to believe they were prophets of the devil. The social atmosphere around Wisteria Rest curdled almost instantly. The Vances became pariahs. Neighbors who had once shared suppers now crossed the road to avoid them. Tradesmen refused to deliver goods, citing vague health concerns. The isolation, once a family choice, became a communal mandate. Nightly, the estate was subjected to informal, fervent prayer vigils. Groups of locals, armed with lanterns and Bibles, would gather at the edge of the property line, chanting hymns intended to drive out the evil spirits they believed inhabited Alara and Lyra. The air was thick with the scent of fear and judgmental fervor. Silas, in a desperate attempt to counter the religious hysteria, placed his hope in the emerging field of rational medical science. He managed to secure a review from Dr. Hawthorne, a state-employed physician with modern, if limited, training in neurology. Hawthorne attempted a systematic, objective investigation. He applied rudimentary psychological tests, measured their physical responses, and searched diligently for any organic cause, a tumor, a neurological lesion, an inherited madness. He found nothing. Physiologically, the twins were perfectly healthy, their brains functioning normally according to the limits of 1870s understanding. The contrast framing here became stark and tragic. Dr. Hawthorne, a man trying to apply logic and evidence, was ridiculed as a foolish materialist by the fearful community. His elegant theories of shared psychosis or pathological cryptomnesia were dismissed as effete intellectualism. The townspeople preferred the visceral, immediate explanation. The girls were vessels of darkness, and their knowledge of the future was the devil's insidious preview of the decay to come. The immense pressure began to crush the twins. Lyra reacted with volatile outbursts, railing against the ignorance and superstition of the century that trapped her. She would scream about civil liberties and education that the community could not comprehend, further cementing their belief in her madness. Alara, true to her 18th-century sensibilities, withdrew into a shell of cold, dignified martyrdom. She viewed the town's persecution as a sad, predictable display of mob hysteria, a recurring feature of human history she had likely seen unfold countless times. The religious condemnation was not an attack on their truth, it was an attack on their very right to exist in 1871. The Vance plantation had become a siege zone, where the forces of fear and dogma were systematically working to suffocate the possibility of the impossible. Isolated and publicly disgraced, Silas Vance played his final card. He wrote to Professor Alastair Thorne, a renowned figure at a distant northern university, celebrated for his pioneering work in philosophy and the nascent field of psychological study. Thorne, a committed rationalist and a skeptic of all spiritual explanation, was initially intrigued by the Vance case, viewing it as a unique opportunity to document an extreme form of delusion or hysteria. He arrived at Wisteria Rest with the clinical detachment of a scientist approaching a specimen, determined to categorize the twins' condition under the emerging umbrella of mental pathology. For 3 months, Professor Thorne conducted an exhaustive, meticulous investigation. He treated the twins not as patients, but as historical and psychological subjects. He engaged Alara in lengthy, formalized debates on 18th-century political economy and Enlightenment philosophy. He found her knowledge flawless, her understanding of figures like Voltaire and Hume not merely academic, but deeply internalized. When tested on contemporary history, she was entirely blank, often becoming visibly distressed by modern concepts like steam trains and industrial manufacturing. Thorne was forced to conclude that if Alara was acting, her performance was a masterpiece of historical verisimilitude requiring genius-level commitment. Lyra's case proved even more destabilizing to the professor's rational framework. Thorne subjected her to complex tests of mathematics and physics. She effortlessly solved problems related to orbital mechanics and quantum concepts, often correcting the professor's own advanced hypotheses with casual certainty. She drew detailed, multi-layered blueprints of devices that simply did not exist, from complex radio receivers to early schematics of high-frequency radar technology. She discussed the social ramifications of these technologies, speaking of the rise of global media and the societal impact of nuclear power with terrifying prescience. Thorne, a man whose life was dedicated to the supremacy of empirical evidence, could not dismiss her knowledge as fantasy, it was too technically accurate. Thorne began to wrestle with his own theories. He first proposed a diagnosis of temporal psychosis, an elegant but ultimately meaningless label suggesting the mind could spontaneously detach from its own timeline. He then considered echo-personality disorder, hypothesizing a genetic anomaly that allowed the girls to access ancestral memories from 2 distinct periods. Yet, neither theory held up to Lyra's startling, active predictions of the future. The twins were not reflecting the past or distorting the present, they were accurately accessing 2 different points on the same chronological line. The climax of this section came during a late-night recording session with Lyra, where she tearfully described the feeling of being born in the wrong time, of missing cities, music, and freedoms that were decades away. She spoke of the inevitability of the First World War with such crushing, personal despair that Thorne, the hardened rationalist, felt genuine terror. He finally realized his error. He was trying to fit an anomaly of physics into a psychological box. He could not explain them because they were not suffering from a disorder, they were living proof of a paradox that negated his entire worldview. The girls were not mad, but merely authentic citizens of their respective centuries. Professor Thorne packed his bags the next morning, leaving behind a heavily annotated journal entry where he finally admitted his failure. His final note, scrawled in trembling handwriting, simply stated, "They are not delusions. They are a profound, living, and terrifying truth that renders my science obsolete." The last hope for a rational explanation was shattered. Following Professor Thorne's abrupt and dispiriting departure, the Vance household settled into a deep, protracted silence, a state of psychological attrition that would define the girls' late adolescence from 15 to 18. All attempts at cure, explanation, or societal reintegration had failed, leaving the family suspended in an agonizing stasis where time passed without relief, and each day reinforced the profound temporal incompatibility that separated Alara and Lyra from each other, and from the world around them. These years were not marked by dramatic events but by the slow, grinding erosion of the mind and spirit, a quiet devastation wrought by living wholly out of sync with one's era. Lyra's depression deepened into a consuming, almost physical weight. She understood the trajectory of the next century, the technological leaps, the cultural revolutions, the freedoms unimaginable to a 19th-century mind, and each day she remained trapped in the gaslit, constrained world of 1870s Georgia was a torment. Hours were spent staring into the flickering light of kerosene lamps, weeping for the simple, brilliant convenience of electric bulbs, for radios and moving images, for a future she would never touch. Conversations about the present fell hollow, she spoke only in nostalgic eulogies to the era she had envisioned, her longing for a time she could never inhabit bleeding through every gesture, every whispered lament. Alara, in contrast, found a terrifyingly serene refuge in her past. Fully inhabiting the mental and cultural framework of the 1780s, she withdrew from contemporary life with glacial composure, treating the 1870s as chaotic, vulgar, and morally inferior. When the twins' 18th birthday arrived, the divide became physically manifest. Lyra had arranged a small, mid-20th century style cake, simple but meticulously described, while Alara sat in the abandoned library, drafting an archaic 1790s legal script. The juxtaposition of the futuristic confection and the meticulously detailed legal document embodied the absolute, unbridgeable temporal rift that had consumed the Vance household, leaving the sisters eternally anchored to worlds they could never share. The emotional and psychological strain of their 18th birthday catalyzed the final, profound act of temporal exile. Alara, having formalized her commitment to the 18th century through her self-drafted will, concluded that mere passive existence in 1871 was no longer tolerable. Her contentment had become a chilling form of calculated resolve. She approached her father, Silas, not with rebellion or hysteria, but with a cold, formal statement of intent delivered with the poise of a diplomat finalizing a treaty. She explained that she could not, in good conscience, continue to live in a time whose customs, politics, and moral code she found so utterly alien and disagreeable. The 1870s were, in her view, a chaotic, unrefined period lacking the elegant structure and defined values of the late Enlightenment. She stated plainly, without emotion, that her life in this century was a violation of her true self, and she needed a structural solution to reconcile her reality with her environment. The solution she proposed was shocking, pragmatic, and entirely consistent with her 1790s mindset. She had identified an old acquaintance of the family, Mr. August Hawthorne, no relation to the doctor, a respectable, elderly lawyer in his late 70s who lived 20 miles distant. Mr. Hawthorne was a noted eccentric who had obsessively preserved his own life and home in the meticulously correct style of the late 18th century. He was a wealthy recluse, deeply steeped in the archaic legal practices and social codes of the pre-federal era. Alara's proposal was a formal request for marriage, framed not as a romantic union, but as a socio-legal necessity. She required a husband who could provide the specific kind of environment, the language, the furniture, the customs, and the intellectual company, that aligned with her actual temporal identity. She argued that only within a domestic setting utterly dedicated to the 1790s could she finally be at peace. To Alara, this was not a shocking act, it was the only rational path forward. Silas Vance was utterly devastated. The proposal represented a complete surrender, a final, definitive severing of the link between father and daughter. He saw his child choosing a life of pretense with a man 3 times her age, not out of passion, but out of cold, temporal loyalty. He begged, he raged, he attempted to appeal to her love for her mother and sister, but Alara remained immovably calm. She looked at him with the gentle patience of an elder explaining a painful but necessary truth to a confused child. "Father," she said, her voice perfectly level, "you cannot ask me to live an entire life as an impostor. I am 18 years old. In my time, I should be married. This man, Mr. Hawthorne, is the only person in this century who lives correctly. He offers me the only sanctuary I will ever know." Silas was trapped in an impossible ethical bind. If he forced her to stay, he would be consigning her to a life of profound psychological anguish, effectively forcing her to live in a century she did not recognize. If he allowed her to go, he would be tacitly acknowledging the impossible truth of her condition and sanctioning his daughter's final, devastating choice of the past over her family. The proposal, cloaked in the language of 18th century formality, was the ultimate collapse of the Vance family unit, a final, horrifying moment of surrender to the temporal schism. He knew, with a crushing certainty, that he had already lost her to another age. Alara's decision to marry and formally exile herself to the 1790s proved to be the final, irreversible catalyst for Lyra's own deteriorating state. If Alara had achieved a cold, formal peace by retreating into the past, Lyra experienced a catastrophic psychological collapse by being violently reminded of her entrapment in a past that was not her own. Alara's departure meant the loss of her only temporal confidant, the only person who truly understood the agony of being mismatched with the timeline. Lyra realized with crushing finality that she was now utterly alone, a solitary messenger from a bright, exciting future, stranded in the quiet despair of the 19th century. Lyra's desperation mutated into a frantic, physical urge to escape, to run toward the future. Her efforts were no longer intellectual, they became primal. She began attempting to sneak away from the plantation, not toward the town, but simply out, believing that if she could just travel far enough, or fast enough, the temporal walls that held her might weaken. Her mind, already strained by the pressure of centuries, began to crumble under the weight of her sister's abandonment and her own terrifying isolation. She obsessed over concepts of time, speed, and communication. She scavenged metal scraps, copper wiring, and broken pieces of machinery, trying to construct rudimentary devices she remembered from her future knowledge, failing instruments designed to pierce the veil. She developed a profound, desperate fixation on the future technologies that allowed for instant communication across vast distances. She believed that if she could simply speak to the right time, she could be retrieved, or at least confirmed. The final, decisive event occurred during a violent, late autumn thunderstorm. The lightning cracked the sky over the plantation, momentarily transforming the dark landscape into a strobe-lit scene of Gothic terror. Lyra vanished from her room during the height of the storm. Her parents, frantic with dread, found her hours later in the furthest field of the property, utterly drenched and convulsing on the muddy ground. She was surrounded by a pathetic scattering of her scavenged materials, wire, tin cans, a shattered glass bottle. She was not screaming the coherent historical facts she once shared. Instead, her language had devolved into a meaningless, terrifying jumble. She was speaking in a furious, uninterrupted stream of technological jargon, dates, and numbers, none of which made coherent sense to her parents. She screamed phrases like, "The speed of light is not enough, must adjust the phase variance." July 20, 1969. Tell them to listen on the frequency 1420. Her words were a chaotic waterfall of future knowledge stripped of its context, the language of the 20th century turned into sheer, desperate noise. As Silas reached for her, trying to soothe her convulsive body, Lyra's eyes rolled back, and she went terrifyingly still. They carried her back to the house, but when the morning came, her bed was empty. There were no signs of a struggle, no tracks in the drying mud, no open windows. Lyra Vance had simply ceased to be present in 1871. Her clothes, her few possessions, and her feverish scribbles remained. The family searched for weeks, fearing she had succumbed to madness and drowned in a nearby creek or run into the woods. But the truth, they silently knew, was far more chilling than a simple runaway. Lyra, the girl who belonged to the 20th century, had vanished, her silence a profound and final statement that the 19th century could not hold her any longer. The only remnant was the haunting cacophony of her last words, the sound of a soul desperately trying to dial into the right time. Lyra's sudden, total disappearance left an absence in the Vance home that was not merely geographical, but ontological. She had been physically present one moment, convulsing with the jargon of the 20th century, and utterly gone the next. The subsequent weeks were characterized by a desperate, agonizing search. Silas, now a broken man, scoured the surrounding counties, presenting Lyra's description, a girl with startlingly modern eyes and clothes, to sheriffs and railway officials. All efforts were futile. The local authorities, recalling the rumors of demonic insanity, quickly dismissed the case as that of an eccentric runaway who had simply succumbed to her own delusions, citing the family's long-established notoriety. They closed the file with the cold finality of administrative indifference. The profound silence that descended upon Wisteria Rest was suffocating. Elizabeth Vance, her faith shattered by the twin paradox, retreated into a permanent state of grief and shock, spending her days tending the overgrown garden, speaking only in whispers. The plantation itself began to decay, the fields untended, the house acquiring a shroud of dust and neglect, becoming a silent monument to fractured time. The town, relieved of the volatile presence of the possessed girls, interpreted Lyra's vanishing as a dark miracle, a curse lifted, or an evil spirit finally expelled. The community quickly enforced a strict, collective silence on the entire affair, erasing the Vance twins from local conversation in a desperate attempt to restore normalcy. Ilara's reaction to her sister's vanishing was the most unsettling of all. She had already moved to the home of Mr. August Hawthorne, her new husband, a remote estate 20 miles away that was meticulously preserved in the style of 1795. Ilara refused to speak of Lyra, offering only a single, chilling statement when pressed by her mother: she has simply returned to where she belonged. The 1870s were never meant to hold her, just as they are an intolerable inconvenience to me. This statement, devoid of sisterly love or sorrow, demonstrated her absolute psychological detachment. In Ilara's rigid, 18th-century mind, Lyra's disappearance was not a tragedy, but a logical, necessary act of temporal self-correction. Ilara settled into her new, antique life with unnerving ease. She became the perfect, dignified gentlewoman of the late 18th century, managing Hawthorne's estate with flawless historical accuracy, discussing politics in archaic language, and demanding social customs long abandoned. She deliberately avoided all modern conveniences and ignored any news or invention post-1800, living her remaining life in a meticulously crafted temporal bubble. She achieved the complete separation from the present that Lyra had desperately sought through flight. The only physical trace of Lyra found was years later. An elderly housemaid, cleaning the disused attic, discovered a small, crumpled piece of paper hidden beneath a loose floorboard. It was a single, hand-drawn sketch, executed with Lyra's frantic, yet technically proficient hand. It was an astonishingly accurate, detailed drawing of a 1950s console television set, complete with rabbit-ear antennae and volume dials. Beneath it, signed simply, L. Vance, was the number 1957. The drawing was an undeniable, tangible message left behind by the girl who belonged to the future, a heartbreaking testament to the time she had been denied, confirming that her mind had been fixed not on fantasy, but on a precise, verifiable point in history decades away. The legacy of the Vance plantation was not a legend of ghosts, but a silent history of paradox. The decades that followed Lyra's disappearance and Ilara's self-imposed exile saw the story of the Vance twins calcify into a silent, macabre piece of local folklore. The official records, sparse and fragmented, became the only remaining truth, the cold, bureaucratic evidence of a warm, human paradox. The narrative now shifts to the present, or a time sufficiently distant from 1871 to allow for the dispassionate examination of the archives. The narrator, taking on the role of the modern investigator, details the painstaking process of piecing together the fractured truth. The search begins with the private notes left by Professor Alastair Thorne. His journal, discovered decades later in a university attic, provided the most comprehensive, if inconclusive, analysis. Thorne's meticulously documented observations, the transcripts of Ilara's perfect 18th-century dialect, the complex schematics drawn by Lyra, and his final, desperate admission of scientific defeat, serve as the core evidence that the phenomenon was not simple delusion, but something that defied the known laws of chronology and psychology. Next, the investigator turns to the records of Dr. Percival Thorne, the family physician. His early medical logs confirm the first sighting of the temporal dissonance at age 6, particularly the unsettling shared memory of the future crop failure and the bizarre description of the television set. These early notes confirm that the anomaly was present from the beginning, not developed through external influence or trauma. The sheer, early innocence of the children, contrasted with the shocking historical knowledge they possessed, only deepens the mystery. The investigation unearths the local newspaper clippings from 1871 and 1872. These pieces are predictably thin, focusing less on the truth of the girl's condition and more on the community's reaction, the public scorn, the religious condemnation, and the brief, dismissive police report regarding Lyra's vanishing, which concluded she was a hysterical runaway. The archives confirm the collective social pressure that effectively drove the Vance family into isolation and suppressed the truth. The story was erased not because it was false, but because it was too terrifyingly real to be integrated into their worldview. The section culminates with the epilogue of Ilara Vance's life. She lived out her days in her meticulously preserved 1795-era home with Mr. Hawthorne. She became a local curiosity, a stiff, archaic woman who demanded to be addressed by titles and communicated only using early American phrasing. She outlived the 19th century entirely, dying quietly in her own bed in 1953. The chilling punchline of her life is that she never once acknowledged any event, person, or technology that emerged after the year 1800. She lived through 2 world wars, the invention of flight, the rise of the automobile, the advent of radio and cinema, and yet, to her dying day, she insisted the year was perpetually between 1795 and 1800. She was a woman who was physically present in the mid-20th century, yet mentally existed 150 years in the past. Her death in 1953 was not a release from the 19th century, but a peaceful ending in the late 18th century, a strange, permanent victory of mind over chronology. Her life confirmed that the temporal schism was not fleeting, it was absolute. The story of Elara and Lyra Vance ends not with a solution, but with a profound, terrifying equation that remains forever unbalanced, vibrating like a discordant note between eras. The documentary concludes by drawing away from the historical minutiae, allowing the mystery itself to exhale, and presenting the audience with a final spectrum of explanations that are all equally plausible, equally impossible, and equally unsettling. The silence that followed their lives, Elara's gentle entombment in the calm constancy of the past, Lyra's violent erasure from the confines of the present, is itself the most resonant proof that something beyond the boundaries of 19th-century comprehension unfolded around them. The psychological hypothesis is the first and most comforting lens, yet also, paradoxically, the least satisfying. Was this merely a case of extraordinary shared temporal hallucination, perhaps a genetic anomaly of cryptomnesia wherein the mind dredges up fragments of unrealized futures or ancestral memory? This perspective imagines the sisters as prodigies of cognition so intense and isolated that they sculpted personalized realities as protective sanctuaries, Elara retreating into curated antiquity, Lyra pulling herself toward a horizon that had not yet dawned. But this theory breaks under scrutiny. Delusion cannot produce verified details, nor can fantasy predict tragedies with eerie precision. Thus the second speculation steps willingly into scientific heresy, suggesting that consciousness may not be bound to linear time at all. Perhaps the Vance property was a geographical fault in the chronology of reality itself, a temporal fissure. The most haunting question, Lyra's disappearance, lingers like a lingering shadow. Did she perish, or did she slip forward into the era she longed for, only to find herself stranded? In the end, the remaining question is an echo: were the Vance twins simply disturbed young women, or were they living contradictions of the universe's most sacred law?